Okay, here's what we're doing. We had started doing a monthly, I guess you could say, Bible study at our church, and a couple people weren't able to be at the last one. So, what I wanted to do is I wanted to make a quick recording. I'm going to try to go through all of the information as quickly as possible while making sure that we touch all of the primary bits of information. Whenever we went through the and set through the Bible course with a number of people there, we basically, I think, took maybe a little over an hour. I hope not to take that long because the simple truth is that there's not going to be an interaction or anything of that nature as what we would have within just a closed, confined, classroom type setting. This is just going to be pretty much an information dump. What we're talking about is who is Moloch, aka Baal, aka Marduk. And what we're talking about deals with basically a lot of your Old Testament type of things as to, and the questions we're going to try to answer are very, very simple. Why is he hated so very much in the Old Testament, this supposed ancient God that is, let's be honest, he's mythology? Why was his worship so severely forbidden? And what does that have to do with the Hebrew people and their belief system? And it also will answer, why did God want to drive them from the land whenever the Hebrews returned up out of Egypt? And it's also we're going to answer the question of what's this have to do anything at all with Christianity? So let's go ahead and jump right in. Where this all starts with is actually a story by the name of, and I'm going to mess up most of these names, but I believe I've always heard it pronounced as the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic. Now, there's a difference and distinction between creation and formation. The Babylonian creation epic is actually more of a formation, and it was written somewhere between 1800 to 1100 BC. Now, obviously, oral traditions would have predated this. Now, who is Marduk? Well, he is a Babylonian god who was simply also called Bel, Bel. Bel, which, if it's lowercase, would mean Lord, like a generic, he is my Lord or King or what have you. And Marduk is one of the main characters in the Enuma Elish. Baal, Baal, is also a generic title of God or Lord. So what you're finding is that those types of words are very, very same, if not similar. And you also find, so we're talking about Marduk and we're talking about Baal, or Marduk who is called Baal who is basically a general title, and then we're also going to talk about Molech, which is also the equal to or similar to the word for king, which is a general title. It's also linguistically, by the way, the word Molech connected to the Hebrew word for shame. Now, for sources for all of this information, the sources you can pretty well find 90% of everything I'm going to talk about, if not more, right off of Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica Online, places like that. You can find this information pretty easily. There's one or two small things that are more of a reference to whenever I was in seminary doing work there that would lend itself to the discussion. But most of those and most all of this you can find pretty well anywhere online if you want to dig into it. So, who is this character, Marduk, Baal, Molech? Well, depending on a region, would dictate which of the similar names, different languages, would be used. He was considered a fertility god and was associated with a bull for his image, which to me strikes a reminder of in the desert whenever Moses crafted the golden calf, and also much later whenever I believe it was the northern kingdom broke off from the southern kingdom, they placed golden calves in the kingdoms there as well, one the far north and one the far south, basically requiring people no longer to go to Jerusalem to worship, but instead to worship at those golden calves. So basically, you have got this fertility god, but also he is known as Marduk, which, if I've read this correctly, it could be pronounced Marutuk, and he was first worshipped in the Babylonian region. Baal was common around Phoenicia, which was also considered a god for sailors. Molech was worshipped in the Ammon region. Bel Hammon, which is a version of Molech, was worshipped in Carthage, a Phoenician colony. Melechart, which is the proper Hebrew spelling for Molech, is yet another name attached to Baal, as most likely the version worshipped by Ahab and Jezebel. Um, and is also most likely known as Beelzebub. And that's a pun, actually. It's Lord of the Flies, which attracts flies, is dung, basically Lord of Dung. Um, Beelzebub, the correct spelling of it is actually Lord of the Manor. Marduk literally means calf of the sun. So what you find is that there are things that are same and there are things that are similar. Same is obviously the same. Whenever you're talking about he's being referenced as Bel, B-E-L, or Baal, B-A-A-L. Those words are obviously very, very same or similar, but they have the same type of meaning. But also, there are things about this that are similar. They have similar stories, they have similar events attached to them, they have similar attributes. The name connection is generally an across the board type of sameness, only changing due to language barriers and oftentimes due to regional separations. During this time period, you have to remember a lot of people would have associated their local god as their local deity. And so what would have happened is they would have allowed that deity to adopt local characteristics. And that's important for us to oftentimes understand because as they would have adapted these into their local languages and things like that, it would have been pretty common. But what you also find is that Marduk, the name itself, fell out of common usage and was in fact abbreviated to Bel, Bel. And of course, it's not much of a stretch to call it Baal from Bel. More or less, the pronunciation is essentially the same in our modern tongue. Now, it's important to note that many ancient cultures would copy from one another and would often just adapt a god to their culture, and this explains the adoption. In addition, if a nation overtook another nation, they would often enforce their gods onto the new nation. This happened, of course, with the Greeks and Roman gods. An early group of the gods became the Titans, who were defeated by the Greek gods. Those gods would eventually fall to the Roman gods. Well, what's interesting about that, though, is it's almost like as though he really didn't fall. He basically just replaced the names. Basically, there are very few differences between the Roman and the Greek gods. And you could possibly maybe even argue that the Greek gods, perhaps the Greek culture, influenced, especially in the arts and such, the Romans more so than what the Romans influenced the Greek. But that's a whole other story. That's something else to consider separate. So, what is Marduk's character? He was a strongman type of deity. I kind of picture Hercules in many ways. He fought an ancient deity by the name of Tiamat. Tiamat was basically this vast monster, and Marduk overcame her. And as a result, Marduk's father, who is known as Ea, I'm not sure the pronunciation, but he's also known as El and Enki. The ELL is important. And Marduk's father was able to create mankind because of Tiamat's destruction, or slaying, whichever you wish to consider there. Now, the importance about El is that that is actually an Old Testament name for God, and it's a shortened, abbreviated version of Elohim. And so that's a vital thing because you've got this character, Marduk, who is the son of El, who is God. El is a name for God. Marduk was basically, as a result of defeating Tiamat, given the right to be the head god. And it's also referenced that he has over 50 names, or said to have had 50 names. I believe there was a scroll or a scribe or a cylinder that contained that information. But he has 50 names, 50 names, sorry. And that, once again, we were talking a little bit about earlier about Marduk, Baal, Moloch, Baal Hammon, Melkart, Beelzebub, these types of things. Those are all names for a similar type of character. In addition, he is associated with fire as he filled his body with flame, among other preparations to fight Tiamat. And as a result, he's considered, after defeating Tiamat, he's considered to me to be the savior of mankind. For he had not been able to slay Tiamat, mankind would have never been able to exist. So what you find is that basically this really smacks of a false faith similar to Christianity. A father, Elohim, El, meaning God, is actually, if I remember correctly, in their interpretation, he is a god of wisdom, but also he is a creator god. You see, what happened was Tiamat, whenever Marduk defeated Tiamat, he actually crafted a net, cast it about her, bound it up, slayed the beast, and actually from the body of Tiamat is where we get the earth, is their idea of creation, or as I said, formation. Like I said, there's a difference between creation and formation. Creation, such as like within the Christian theology, is literally pops out of nothing. God created it. Formation is Marduk crafted it from something. So, Marduk's father, uh, El, Inky, Ea, as I'm as you're referencing those, I'm not always 100% sure on the exact pronunciation, but what you find is that Elohim is a reference to God in the Old Testament, God the Father. And of course, having a son who is considered the savior of man, Marduk, it's basically a counterfeit faith. And what's interesting is a lot of people have tried to claim that Christianity actually copied it, and we'll get into that in just a bit because this is important to note. Now, whenever you look into the Old Testament, you find Baal appears in the neighborhood of about 90 times. He's first mentioned in the book of Judges, which was roughly 1100 to 1000 BC. He's most well known in the account of Elijah and the priest of Baal, which takes place in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 18. Um, and there's a quote from the book of 2 Kings, chapter 23, verse 10, and it says, "And he, King Josiah of Judah, defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the children of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter to pass through the fires of Moloch." So, what do we have here? We have got a fertility god who's basically a strong character, like a Hercules type character, defeats Tiamat, allowing the creation and formation of man to take place, and he is considered as a result to have really been a great boon to mankind historically in their mythology. So, if you begin to look at that, as I said, it smacks of a counterfeit faith. But whenever you begin to look into the Old Testament, there's a lot of things that you have to be able to answer. And those things are very, very simple. Why is Marduk hated so much? Well, I think we've kind of answered that. One of the reasons why is because he is, in fact, very much almost like a counterfeit Christ. And why was his worship forbidden? Well, one of the reasons why is because it was child sacrifice. Oftentimes, what would happen is the eldest born would actually be sacrificed. And I believe in Carthage, there was something like 1,400 bodies of children found that had been sacrificed to Moloch. And I think that the correct one there was Baal Hammon was worshipped there in Carthage. And basically, it was the same type of worship, though, across the board. It was a child sacrifice. They would also, I believe, if I remember correctly, there were 7 different things they would sacrifice. One was a child, one was a lamb, one was this, one was that, and on so. And so what you find is Marduk is actually hated because he's a counterfeit version of Christianity, being the idea of being a savior God, but also the act of his worship was particularly disgusting because it is debasing the importance of children and debasing the importance of the future that they would carry. And whenever you look at around the culture at us today, what are we doing with our children anymore? It seems as though in a lot of ways we are oftentimes allowing children to be desensitized to the world around us. And it's a very, very frightening prospect if we continue to go down that particular road. So, talked a little bit about how this does have some similarities to Christianity, how it could be interpreted an interesting way. Now, one thing also to point out, though, is that, and before we go too much further, remember, they're into child sacrifice, and oftentimes it would have been the eldest, the firstborn, who would have been sacrificed. Now, think about this for a moment. In the Old Testament, in the Garden of Eden, you had Adam and Eve, and in chapter 3, you have the fall of man taking place. And one of the first things that takes place, chapter 3, verse 15, is actually the prophecy of the fact that someday would come the Savior, and he would crush the head of the serpent, and that the serpent would strike his heel. And that is considered one of the in fact, actually, it is the very first prophecy of the coming of the Messiah. In fact, Adam and Eve, if you ever read many of the ancient texts talking about Adam and Eve, they were entirely committed to the idea that their offspring would, in fact, allow them somehow, some way, to be able to re-access the Garden of Eden. And in many ways, that is in fact actually what Christianity is striving toward, the idea of getting back into where we were supposed to have been. The Garden of Eden is where we actually belong. But think about this for a moment. That prophecy came that the that the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head. Meanwhile, you have a false religion out there who is asking for the destruction of children. I think you see another reason why God the Father of the Old Testament, would have had a distinct hatred of this particular cult. Because in many ways, if he could have had this child sacrificed in the fires of Moloch instead of raised up, or even cut off a line that would have led to the birth of this child, he would have thought he would have won. God would have found a way to overcome, but that was an attempt on the side of evil to overcome. And in the end, of course, how can you stand against God? You cannot. So, what influence did this cult have on the Hebrew people? And what did they copy from it? Well, question, and the very simple answer is none. Abraham left the area of Babylonian influence before the rise of the cult. He left roughly in 2200 BC. By the time the cult made its way to what would become Israel, the descendants of Abraham were already living in Egypt. They had moved off into Egypt in 1900 BC, and the cult did not reach its highest level acceptance in even just Babylon until 1800 to 1700 BC under the kingship of Hammurabi's code, if you would. The Hebrew people did not return until roughly 1400 BC, and the first mention of the cult isn't until the book of Judges around 1100 to 1000 BC. Or in other words, what you have taking place is over in Babylon, the Mediterranean area, or not the Mediterranean, I'm sorry, the Mesopotamian area, where you've got the Tigris and Euphrates River. This is where this cult is really starting from, in that region. And God had called Abraham out of that region already. And by the time that it even had taken off over there, Abraham was well out of the area. And not only that, his descendants were already in Egypt. Why is that important? The Egyptians were very ethnocentric. They did not mix with other ethno groups. And if you remember, the Jewish people were the Hebrew people were given their own specific area to live within. And as a result, they were basically surrounded by the Egyptians culturally, but yet not allowed to intermingle with the Egyptians culturally. And what this did was this actually buffered them against this early cult that was beginning to spread up out of the Mesopotamian Valley, and eventually would have arrived in what would have been considered the ancient kingdom of Israel. So, by the time they begin to come back, you're looking at roughly 1400 BC. They come back into the land, and God is telling them to drive these people out because there is terrible things amongst them. But also, you never even see a mention of it specifically until 1100 to 1000 BC, which, if you remember, I mentioned about the golden calf that took place during the Exodus itself, the whole event. So I'm not sure exactly how all those puzzle pieces really fit together, but what you do know is this. I believe as they came up and out, there would have been a little bit of talk about this particular other being, but the people were very, very devout, especially the generation of, I guess you could say, the post-Exodus. The people of the Exodus, some of them were grumblers and wanted to go back and things like that. And other ones, of course, as they were replaced, due to age and everything else during the wandering years in the desert, the 40 years, those people were very devout. They may have heard about this stuff, but they had nothing to do with it. And so, what we do know is this. The Hebrew people didn't learn of it prior to the Exodus, obviously, because they were sheltered by the Egyptian culture. And the Egyptian culture had its own pantheon of gods. And as I said, they were very, very hostile to outsiders, very ethnocentric. But the Hebrews had only gained favor because of Joseph. And of course, even then, like I said earlier, they lived separately from the Egyptians and had their own culture. And so what took place is basically they would have driven into what would be considered now the Old Kingdom, and they would have wanted to drive these other people out as God had told them to do. But the thing is that cult would have been, I don't want to say necessarily embedded into the land yet, but it definitely had an influence and sway there by this time period. There's no arguing that. And so, what I would suggest to you is this: the importance of who Molech is basically all comes down to this. He is a false Christ. He is a false religion that was worshipped so long ago. But in addition to it, he was a counterfeit to Christianity in so many different ways. And what you find is that, much like whenever Herod tried to kill all the children there, whenever he had learned about Christ having been born, it's almost like a predating of that, where they were trying to execute and trying to rid the land of a possibility of this Christ being born someday by cutting off the line. Because if you look through the Old Testament, you find that whenever Abraham blesses his son, he blesses his son, he blesses, and it keeps passing down and down and down. That's of a great value, and it means very much. And that line had to have been protected. And by them actually having been over into Egypt, that line was actually protected. It's one of those things where sometimes the ones who are actually dumping on you are not always actually really hurting you, but sometimes the ones who dig you out of that are not really always your friends. So what you find is that basically there's a lot of people who try to argue that Christianity copied from this particular cult. It's not possible. The reason it's not possible is because, first off, the events of Genesis chapter 3, the actual foretelling of it having taken place of a Messiah, really developed entirely separate. It's developed down in around Mount Sinai, and was totally separate from the Mesopotamian influences, because they were coming out of an Egypt influenced area. And so what you find is that anyone going back would have known of the story of Adam and Eve. A lot of old fables and stories would have been kept and saved. So to have been able to create or craft a false narrative wouldn't have been impossible. Or, I don't even want to say false narrative, basically put your own spin on it type thing. Would have been definitely possible. But at the end of all of it, what you really find is that the reason why Baal, Moloch, Marduk, why he is hated so very much, is because of the fact that he's false. He's a false god, mocking Christianity, mocking so much of what God was trying to do and what he did do through his son. But also what you do find is that those who would try to claim that he influenced Christianity, or that's where they stole the idea of Christianity from, with this savior of man, they just simply don't know what they're talking about. In fact, you could actually argue the exact opposite. This was a brief recording. I tried my best to try to trim this down from the Bible study the other day. And of course, there would have been much discussion, obviously, within that group, and there was. But I wanted to make this kind of a quick rundown. It looks like it's only been about 20 something minutes. But I really think this really helped kind of highlight the primary points and such. And as we go through different things, I think that studying this kind of stuff is important, because it helps us to know where it is we've come from, what the importance of what a lot of this old and ancient things really are. But more importantly, it's also a good reminder, because if you ever forget this, to sin is to literally just to miss the mark. And a lot of people back then were deceived. And one of the key things that was a part of their deception was the overall degradation of society itself. And you're seeing that again. That's worrisome.